Good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful, wonderful to be here. We had the pleasure of hosting the Giving USA results release last summer with Jean and Una and their teams in San Francisco, and have really built a really wonderful relationship. We've been a long-time supporter of the Lilly School, and so it's wonderful to be on your home turf to be able to talk to you about something that's interesting to me and us, and to get your feedback at the same time. So since taking my role as president of Schwab Charitable 4 years ago, and I've been affiliated with Schwab Charitable for about 8 years, and at Schwab for over 20 years, I've been really, really impressed, but a little bit puzzled by the charitable ecosystem in which we in this room all operate, especially as compared to the for-profit ecosystem that I had been accustomed to in my first 20-so years of work. So I'm impressed by the people, the talent, the passion, the drive to make a difference, and the people in this room who've chosen to make their careers in nonprofit understand that better than anyone. But I've been puzzled, and early on I never understood why it was, and I think we're starting to get our head around it, as to why there is this impression that when it comes to fundraising, which of course is the lifeblood of all charitable organizations, the media especially has made it out to be a zero-sum game. That if one charitable cause or sector succeeds, another one must be suffering. So we've been giving some thought to why this might be, especially since we have been succeeding and others accuse us of causing them to suffer. And I want to present to you today just a thought-provoking alternative ecosystem, as I call it. One in which all of us share responsibility for making sure that the pie does grow, so that it's not a zero-sum game. And I'll talk to you a bit about what we're doing as an organization to try to do our part. Certainly be interested, if we have time for questions and answers, to hear other people's perspectives. So let's start by taking a look at this graph published by Giving USA that shows that in inflation-adjusted dollars, so this is all inflation-adjusted, giving has been increasing over time. Obviously, when you have recessions, there are declines. Sometimes they can be steep. And the most recent giving numbers in inflation-adjusted dollars are just now reaching the point that they were prior to the previous recession. But giving is growing. It's surprising, though, oftentimes when the media calls me, though, they're asking why giving is stagnant. And we wondered what's the perspective that they have on why they believe giving is stagnant. Their perspective is really driven by this slide here, which shows that as a percentage of income, giving has been hovering around 2% for the past 30 or so years. We'll see a few different slides, but when I talk about income, this particular measure is disposable income, which is total income minus taxes. Income grows, obviously, the total dollars grow, but as a percent of income, we're stagnating. People have been giving the same proportion of their income for years. So do we just accept this, or is there an opportunity for us to improve on this 2% and go beyond 2%? To answer that question, we have to dig a little bit deeper. We know that a majority of households give. Recent polls by the Millennial Impact Project and Gallup show similar results. More than 80% of millennials and Americans are generally self-report charitable giving. For Americans who earn more than $75,000, 95% say that they give. So most of us give in some way. It's not a matter of introducing new people to the concept of giving. So what else might explain the stubbornly static level of giving, at least from the press's perspective? So this slide was just released a few months ago as part of the Money for Good research that was completed in the summer throughout 2015 and just published. And in their entire 150-page deck, I think this was the most shocking piece of information that I saw. And then I spoke with Una to see if the Lilly School could validate or have their own perspective. And I thought that the graphic representation here of how much people are actually giving of their income, and I'm sure if I did a straw poll here, many of us don't really quite know what portion of our income we're giving. It's hard enough to keep track of everything we give. But this slide shows, and Una's research also shows, that in general, people are giving, a vast majority of Americans are giving less than 1% of their income. There is a tail when you go out to sort of 10%, as tithing would recommend. A small portion of Americans are able to do that. But many, many people are giving less than 1% of their income, which to me I thought was shockingly low, and I'm sure that they may not even be aware of that. And this is in an environment where, at least over the past 20 years, we've seen huge wealth accumulation. The share of wealth owned by the top 3% of the households grew from 45% in 1992 to 55% in 2013. Their share of income rose from 23% to 30%. The stock market indices tripled during this same time period. So there is wealth being generated, yet sort of a stagnant portion of people's income and potentially wealth being given. You understand that while we have lots of wealth, we have sort of similarly increases in needs and some very, very, very large needs out there. So can we give more? And what would be a reasonable amount to give? Every person is going to have a different answer to that question based on their own experience and values. But it's important to know that very small increases can make a big difference. So Una and her team helped us to sort of think through some various scenarios. When you take a look at that earlier slide I showed you, it shows such a dramatic number of people giving less than 1% of their income, and thought through three just sort of very basic scenarios. One is, if everyone who gives less than 2% of their income just gave 0.5% more, how much more in giving might we see each year? It's $23 billion. What if every person who makes more than $1 million a year gives 1% more of their income? So if they're currently giving 3% on average, which is about on average what they give, if they give 4%, will they really miss it? That's another $10 billion. And what if people who are making more than $10 million a year give an extra 2%? So if they're currently giving 6 to 8% on average, they give 8 to 10%, it's another $10 billion. So in total, over $40 billion, which is about 15% of the $260 billion you saw in the first slide in individual giving, just by sort of some small adjustments that people could make. So how do we motivate people to give more? So at Schwab Charitable, we've been thinking about this question, and we first sort of think, well, let's understand what the barriers may be to their giving. Number one, you have the argument of security. Obviously, people who don't feel financially secure say that they can't afford to give. Even the wealthy say they can't afford to give or don't want until they feel that to that point that they are really, truly financially secure. Some people are skeptical about how charitable donations are spent. Alan Hassenfeld this morning spoke a bit about the skepticism around giving year after year and not really understanding what difference it might make and starting to get more involved. So that certainly is a barrier. Third, there is sort of a feeling at sometimes of being overwhelmed, ill-equipped, hard to decide where to give. How do I keep track of giving? How do I do my taxes? The digital environment in some ways can make this even harder. And so as a result, people don't feel organized and sort of put it off and don't give as much or as often as they could. But perhaps one of the largest barriers is the barrier here represented in green, which says satisfied with their giving levels. Many people report that they are satisfied with how much they're giving. And we refer to this as the above average bias. And again, money for good, and this applies not only to giving, it applies to your looks, your driving abilities, your intelligence, your weight. I think behavioral scientists would say we are hardwired to see ourselves as average or above average. And in fact, money for good, the second favorite slide in their most recent research, was that in their research, 75% of people believe they give more than average, but actually 73% actually give less than average. People in this audience, by and large, are out sort of trying to pound the pavement to overcome this bias. And we believe that you need help from people like us in a position we hope to help. So that gets us to the topic of the conversation today, which is if we want to go beyond 2%, if this number of 2% of income really can be moved, how can financial services providers help? So Schwab Charitable is sponsored by Charles Schwab and Company, financial service provider. Charles Schwab himself, very philanthropic individual, very much dedicated to trying to make a difference in this area. Now, there are many types of charitable vehicles and philanthropic services offered by financial services providers. The rest of my remarks are going to focus on donor-advised funds because it's something I know a lot about. It's a space that Schwab has chosen to make an effort in. But I would be happy afterwards to discuss with any of you many of the other vehicles offered by financial services advisors or utilized as part of estate planning that get at this. So let me offer a perhaps controversial, there we go. So now I need to speak a little more softly so I don't blow you out. Let me offer a perhaps somewhat controversial opinion, particularly in the media, but perhaps in this room also, which is that donor-advised funds that are offered by financial services providers are really part of the solution, not part of the problem, to the going beyond 2%. How many of you all, just show of hands, are familiar with donor-advised funds? So most of the room. How many of you have fairly regular donors to your organizations from donor-advised funds? Okay, about half the room. How many of you have your own donor-advised funds personally? Maybe 20%. So when you think about donor-advised funds, be honest, I'm going to give you a choice. How many of you sort of have a warm, fuzzy feeling when you think about donor-advised funds versus having a feeling of being threatened? So how many warm, fuzzy feel like these have been good tools? How many feel honestly somewhat threatened by the rise of donor-advised funds? Okay, well I have a friendlier audience than I thought. So I'm glad that there's a familiarity, and we'll walk through a bit about how Schwab thinks about the sector as well. So since everybody's familiar with donor-advised funds, I think you understand that they're meant to overall increase the level of giving, allowing people to contribute, invest the money while it's waiting to be granted, and then grant it out to any IRS 501c qualified charity. Donor-advised funds generally strive to overcome the big barriers to giving, the four that we had talked about before. We remove concerns of financial security by making the charitable planning process, bringing it forward, incorporating it into the wealth management process so that when people are setting goals for their retirement, for college saving, they can also set goals for charity, that it's not an additional thing they have to do outside of their financial and wealth management discussions. We also make it easier to transfer between accounts, from investment accounts to charitable accounts, so that people, again, at the end of the year when it comes to thinking about tax planning, that they are a little more equipped to be handling a charitable discussion and a charitable decision. We try to remove confusion by giving people simple, convenient tools, helping them to get the tax benefits, keeping track of everything in one place. I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. And helping charities work with donors who may want to give appreciated assets that the charities aren't able to really manage themselves. Donor advised funds, I think, serve a purpose in helping to handle that part of the transaction so that charities don't have to spend the time and the money to do so. We, over time, hope that we help donors build confidence about the charities they're giving to. Certainly, we prevent donors from being able to give to charities that aren't good charities. There have been some frauds out there that we have caught over the years. And I think one of the challenges we have as an industry is how we can continue to get information in front of donors that help them make the best decisions that they can. And in general, just trying to motivate donors by putting all of their charitable giving into one place rather than have it scattered around. So what does this look like, at least at Schwab? And for any of you who may have accounts at a financial services provider that has donor advised funds, you will be familiar with this. But at Schwab, we do our best in everything we do to try to bring charitable planning and giving into everyday financial and wealth management. So if I log on to my Schwab account, whether I do it from my computer, from my tablet, or from my phone, I will see all my Schwab accounts, including my charitable account. To the right here, when I click on my charitable account, I will be given an up-to-date measure of how much I've contributed to that account this year, last year, 5 years, 10 years since inception, you can choose, and how much has been granted. So this concept of not knowing how much you're giving, how it might compare to your income or your wealth becomes a little bit less excusable when you've got everything in one place. A client would also see their grant history reflected back at them, again, every time they log in. So the left here, you see recommendations by sector. It's a reflection in the mirror. It doesn't lie. This is the truth. You, again, can look at it since inception, year to date, last 5 years, and see if this really does reflect the values you want to be reflecting. My personal story on this was in 2008 when I looked at my dashboard and noticed that I had five children. I was giving a disproportionate amount to education during that phase of my life, yet communities near me were suffering. And I looked at my dashboard and I said, this pie chart doesn't feel like who I am. It's way too weighted toward education, not nearly weighted enough to the local community, which is when I started giving a pretty significant amount to my food bank, which is a donation that's continued and is now a recurring grant. So having this pie chart always there to look at and make sure that it reflects your values is important. And then obviously on the right, your top 5 charities. It's always interesting if someone were to say, what are the 5 charities you give the most to? Many of you may keep good records and know that, and other people might be surprised at what this shows. And again, it can help people to adjust their strategies. Most importantly, donor advised funds that are affiliated with financial services providers can really make it easier to get tax-advantaged appreciated investments to charities, which should hypothetically, and we will show with our data, lead to greater levels of giving. Rather than selling the securities and donating the cash proceeds to charity, if people donate securities to charity, they forgo the capital gains tax, which should lead to 20% more in giving. We help to streamline that process using an online experience. Many large charities can handle this, many small charities can't, and it's a service that we provide. We've got the expertise to do it. We have a number of donors who will give appreciated investments at the end of a year and grant it out within a few days. Others might grant out over a longer period of time, but it's a service that we're very proud to offer. And then obviously for those donors who want to save for some charitable goal, one of my favorite stories is a physician that uses his charitable account much like you would use a 401k or retirement account. He puts $100 a month in. He's been doing it for 20 years. He's saving for a retirement goal, which is that he's going to go and serve in underdeveloped cities and communities and help build hospitals. but rather than give that amount little by little, he'd like to save it. So he is working in that way. Others will give money and then invest it for short periods of time before they grant it out. This is a fairly typical asset allocation where people can invest and over time see their money grow. And collectively, this past year, the money contributed to Schwab Charitable accounts by its donors had grown $1 billion since our inception over 15 years ago. So it really does make a difference for those donors who utilize these services. So we know that for our clients, having a charitable account does encourage giving. This quote on the left is very indicative of what our clients say in recent testimonials. But even more excitingly, our current survey that's underway, and this is as of yesterday, 71% of people say they give more because they have these types of accounts. They also grant very actively, and these statistics I think are very important. They're very similar for Fidelity Charitable and Vanguard Charitable, who are the other two large providers. Some in the press would like to believe that because donor advised funds don't have a mandated minimum payout, that people don't utilize them actively, when in fact the opposite is true. So over a 5 to 10 year period, if you look at the amount granted versus the contributions that came in, the number is 76%. Over 10 to 15 years, it's 90%. Another way that people like to compare us is to say what portion of your assets in any given year are being distributed. For the national providers, we're at 21 to 25%. Again, we're not part of the problem. Some of the statistics that are quoted out there for other donor advised funds are a little bit lower. These numbers, again, are 4 times or so the amount that's mandated by distribution for private foundations. So again, very money in motion, very active donors. And serving all eligible 501c3s. We are agnostic. We do not stop grants going as long as the charity is qualified. We've supported almost 100,000 charities since inception and over 40,000 just last year. So how can charities and fundraisers like those of you in the room best work with us? And it sounds like many of you are working with us already. And I just wanted to walk through just a few different ideas. Number one is just, let's all recognize our common goals here. We are all about increasing giving. As I mentioned before, Chuck Schwab is very philanthropic. We offer this service because our clients want it. It's part of what it means to be a saver, an investor. As people get wealthier, this is a service that they want, and they want it combined with their other financial and wealth management. So that's why we're doing it, not because we're trying to sort of take something away from someone else. We tend to be really good at simplifying the donor experience. We're good at simplifying client experience on the investment side. So our goals, I think, with you all are to make things easier for donors and to try to reduce the costs associated with things like accepting complex assets, like making grants. So a lot of the systems and infrastructure that we have in place, I think, can be helpful to the sector, and we do have common goals. The second thing that I would ask is that for those of you who are getting donor advised fund donations, that you acknowledge and cultivate these donors. So 97% of them are known to you. Again, big myth. Yes, people can give anonymously, but in our case, less than 3% do. You know 97% of the names. You know a little bit smaller percentage of their addresses, but I think it's very similar. I think Barbara in an earlier panel was talking about the ALS challenge and what portion of people who did the Ice Bucket Challenge ended up wanting to be engaged with the charity afterwards, and it was around 60%. I think about 60% of these donors also are giving you the addresses. If you have their addresses, make sure that you reach out to them. If you don't have their addresses and they're a large donor, I have a feeling you know how to get their addresses. So I would definitely acknowledge and cultivate them. These people have a ready pool of funds. They are loyal. Very high percentage of people have recurring grants or are going to be reminded when they look at their grant history, oh, I haven't given to this charity in a year, and they will give to you again. And then most importantly, they are what I call recession resilient. So if you have recessionary times, this is a pool of money. People will tend to keep their giving at the same level, sometimes even higher during a recession than you would if you didn't have a ready pool of funds, because you've already set it aside, you've already gotten your tax break. So acknowledge and cultivate them, just as you would other donors. There's a recent article that just came out this week, I think on the Chronicle of Philanthropy, that talked about some charities going so far as to look at where their donor advised fund donors are coming from, zip codes, demographics, and doing outreach in those areas, because it usually indicates a pocket of people who have some level of wealth and are thinking strategically about their giving. If you're not already, let us help you with complex asset acceptance. This is our bread and butter. It's what we do really well. It's no cost to you, but if you have someone coming to your charities with publicly traded securities are easy, but restricted stock, initial public offerings, real estate, a lot of the stuff that's hard to get at, we can help turn those into contributions. They can then turn around and grant to your charity. But let us help you with that. It's a big expense and a lot of expertise that you all don't need to be investing in. And then finally, there is something called the DAF Direct widget. It's something that's been sponsored by Fidelity Charitable, Schwab Charitable, and we are beginning to add community foundations. Kansas City is the first to be involved, that allows charities to go ahead and solicit donations from people with donor advised funds from their site. So I would encourage any of you who are interested in this to go to dafdirect.org and learn more about it. But this is a way, again, that if you're trying to raise money, rather than just use checks and credit cards, this is one other avenue that you have. Then you know that you have people using this you know are philanthropic and have money. So in closing, I'd like just to say that together we can make a big difference. We're all in this together. I think growing giving beyond the 2% of income is a lofty goal, but it's totally achievable. And by bringing charitable giving forward in people's thought process, making it part of their everyday thought process when they're looking at their money, when they're checking their bank account, and when they're managing their investments, that we can be helpful as part of that process. So thank you so much for your time. And I think we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions if anyone would like to ask any questions.
I can't help but take this opportunity to ask the question on the historical association of the donor advised funds in the commercial sector, your sector, with the donor advised funds within community foundations, and the history of anxiety, particularly among community foundations. And so how do you see that going forward in terms of the future, of how that relationship might be getting better? And I think it maybe is, but do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So very good question. The community foundations were the first to offer donor advised funds, and I'll give a little bit of context. Until 1991, I think it was, when Fidelity Charitable became the first, I think, financial services provider to offer them. And at that point, I think there was a bit of skepticism around motive. The IRS approved Fidelity Charitable as a donor advised fund, I think without a lot of scrutiny, and there was concern at that point that there must be a profit motive here, right? This is a for-profit company wanting to take assets and not distribute them. So we now have 20 plus years of history, and I think some of the statistics that you've just seen that I think have given a lot more comfort to community foundations and regulators around the motive for national, what we call, some people call us commercial providers. We refer to ourselves as national providers because, you know, from my perspective and my colleagues' perspective at Fidelity and Vanguard, and we do work closely as an industry, this is the farthest thing from a profit center in our organizations that you can imagine. So we just paid off a loan to Schwab that took 15 years to pay off. They've waived facilities fee, all sorts of fees. We sit in offices, use technology that they don't charge us for. So it is very much a charitable endeavor. So I would just say sort of from the motive of the providers associated with financial services, I think the data now speaks for itself, and our 15-year history, Fidelity's 20-plus year history, I think speaks for itself. The community foundations, I think there was a period of time that there was a lot of mistrust and some money flowing on, honestly, the pricing that we can offer makes the industry more efficient, and it's less expensive than some community foundations offered, so I think it put them in a position of having to justify their value added, which is still on the grant advice, networking, community interaction space. And my sense, at least since I've been involved, is that they become more comfortable with where their value added is. We refer people to community foundations all the time. If they're looking for grant advice, if they're looking for deep connections in their community, they belong with the community foundation. So there's more sort of cross-pollination. We do work together on some industry panels because there are some interesting regulations that have been proposed over the years, most recently in the CAMP tax proposal around donor-advised funds in general. So I work very closely with Emmett Carson and Silicon Valley Community Foundation, even though we share donors, and arguably some of their donors could be our donors and vice versa. So I think it's going to improve because again, we have a lot in common. We're going to be, I hope, continue to be regulated as an industry and thought of as an industry. So I think that it's a lot better than it was 10 years ago, and it will be a lot better 10 years from now than it is now.